Hello, everyone. Good evening. My name is Sarah Fox. I'm the host of Sense of Place, and I am excited because we're here with season 12, and I'm especially excited for Michael Bugh tonight. Many of you know that Sense of Place is a program of the Mount Adams Institute. And each month, starting tonight and running through April, we will have a lecture by someone or someones who have a particular knowledge about the gorge. And that can be knowledge about the natural world here, the history of this place, the culture of this place. And so, Michael, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Okay, here we are. I live at the very end of a 2-mile-long dirt road, and so I have very poor internet service. We'll do the best. But what got me started was a question from Dr. Ammirati at the University of Washington in about 2007. That's it started on this book. Are there any Cortinarius under the oaks? And all 4 mushrooms in this photograph are Cortinarius mushrooms. And I told him I had never noticed any under oaks, but he'd asked me in November, which it turns out that's when they fruit. I went out and found 4 species of Cortinarius and photographed them and did the DNA, not the microscopy, not the DNA, and sent it in, and they were all 4 new species. And then a week later, I was out at Syncline Winery visiting with James Mentone, the owner, and he said, well, he has these beautiful Cortinarius mushrooms under his oaks by the winery, and he couldn't find them in any of his books. And I went out and found, 4 to 6 different Cortinarius, and they were 4 to 6 more brand new species, never named before. So I got very excited and started collecting Cortinarius, which I am still doing, and many of these are still need to be identified. Indeed, all 4 of these still remain to be named because it can take years to name a single mushroom. You've got to study them worldwide and make sure that it hasn't been named somewhere else in the world by someone else. And then you need to know enough about its ecology before you just slap a name on something. And so the next thing that happened is I decided to write some stories just about hunting mushrooms, but I had no intention of writing a book about how to identify the mushroom. It's just mushroom collecting stories from the gorge. Again, Dr. Ammirati says, oh, I'm so thrilled you're writing an identification book. We really need it for the gorge. And I submitted the publication to Timber Press, and they said, well, they already had a mushroom book. They weren't interested. And then I got some advice from Noah Siegel, who's written and published Mushrooms of the Redwood Coast and does a really great job of writing. And he said, oh, the topic was too limited. So I changed the title to Mushrooms of Cascadia when I looked around and realized that we have virtually every single ecosystem found anywhere in the entire Cascadia region. That's from southern Alaska to central California, all in the gorge. Plus we have a whole bunch of unique things. And so this is the book that resulted, a picture of the front and the back cover. And my goal was to create a book that you could slip in your knapsack and take with you in the field to identify mushrooms, a book that would have a lot of species and the key features. Because one of my challenges in many mushroom field guides is you'll have 2 mushrooms described side by side, but they don't really tell you how to definitively tell the 2 mushrooms apart. And so this is what this book is all about. And it's designed for anyone from the very, very beginner to the very advanced person. Tried to keep the language simple. And so here's what the book looks like a little bit inside. There's some safe hunting techniques in the beginning and a few recipes, but it really starts on page 17 with a 3-page, basically, key to the key. So you first look at the at the gilled mushrooms, mushrooms that have a gill on the underside. And if that is, you would go to key lead 175A on page 139. But if you've got something that looks like a club, then you would go to page 135 and start at key lead 168A. If it feels like jelly and looks like jello, then another lead. Or if it's got teeth, if it's a coral-like mushroom, and then is it a puffball-like thing, or a bird's nest, or a stinkhorn, a truffle, a polypore? And then we have some various kinds of ascomycetes. That's these three pictures here, boletes and chanterelles. And at the last entry in this 3-page introduction to the key is the chanterelles. Now, in this book, I have every single chanterelle that's named, every single good edible bolete that we have a name for, every morel that we've got a name for, and all of the really poisonous mushrooms. But given that we have around 4,000 mushrooms, actually probably in the gorge, and I've covered over 1,000, a typical field guide covers 300 to 500 species, there's going to be a lot of things that aren't in the book. And even when I was out with Sarah a week ago, I found something that I'd only seen once in my entire life. And it was a parasite, this kind of a parasite right up here that grows on it's an ascomycete that grows on another mushroom. I'd only seen it once, but I'd never seen it growing on the mushroom it was growing on. It was very beautiful. I got very excited. So then if we take a look at how the book itself is laid out, so we move from the key itself into the chanterelles. And I try and put all the things together so that people can easily compare one mushroom to another. And so that's how I structured the book. And now let's take a look at some of the things that are in the book and that got me started. This is Courtneris valingae. It is named in honor of Dutch mycologist working at University of California, Berkeley. And she's a really, really great mycologist. And so this mushroom was named in honor of her. We found it under oaks here, but it also turns up in British Columbia and down into California. And this thing can be as big in diameter as a dinner plate. Gorgeous, big, beautiful thing. And it was just shocking to me that this had never been described, never been named. So this is one of the mushrooms that I got to name and got me started. And this is one of the ones from Syncline Winery, right behind where James was living at the time. This beautiful Courtneris albolilocynus. Now I use entirely scientific names because those names are common worldwide. Even if a Japanese person picked up this book and looked and they saw Courtneris albolilocynus, if it grew in Japan, it probably doesn't. But if they had it, it would have exactly this name, Courtneris albolilocynus. It would have a lot of other stuff in Japanese, and conversely, I can pick up a Japanese mushroom book and I can tell every mushroom that's in there and figure out whether or not it's something that we also have. But the other thing I like about the scientific names as often as possible, when the mushroom is distinctive, we try and use the name to tell you about how distinctive it is. So albo for white and lilocynus for the lilac color. And this starts out white and then gets more lilac and then bleaches in age, and it has these beautiful lilac gills. Absolutely gorgeous mushroom. This is a little bit bigger in diameter than a coffee cup saucer. And also at Syncline Winery, I came up with Courtneris amabilis. Now, these pictures don't really do it justice. It is literally electric yellow, this gorgeous yellow with these orange splotches. Now, how do I know it's a Courtneris? All Courtneris mushrooms have rusty brown spores, and you can see on the stem where I'm pointing the pointer, that's where there was a cobwebby-like veil that went from the stem to the edge of the cap, and it protected the gills until protected the gills into spores until the spores were mature, and then the ring falls away, just leaves these hairs, but the hairs on the stem capture the spores. And in identifying guild mushrooms, knowing the spore color is critical. And so we tell people you've got to take a spore print. You cut the stem off the mushroom, you lay it down on a piece of white paper. You always use white paper. You cover it with something to keep it moist, and so it doesn't dry out. And you look at it again an hour, and if it's dropping its spores, there'll be a nice pattern of the gills on the paper with the spores in the spore print. And even a white spored mushroom can be detected on white paper. And if you're not sure whether you got a spore print or not, you rub your finger across. And if it's a white spored mushroom and it didn't look like it's spore printed, but you get white on your finger, then you knew you had a white spored mushroom. But as often as possible, I save that job of taking it into the lab and cutting the stem off and laying it on a piece of white paper. I just look for a spore print on the stem of the mushroom, or if two mushroom caps are overlapping each other, look at the top of the cap of the lower cap. I can often figure out what mushroom I'm dealing with. Now, here's a mushroom that was about, this clump was about 3 feet in diameter, stood about a foot tall. I had never seen anything like it. And in fact, when I posted the pictures of this thing to Mushroom Observer, which goes worldwide, nobody had seen anything like it. David Aurora, the author of Mushrooms Demystified, one of the early big mushroom books, got so excited he jumped in his car and drove all the way up here from California just to look at this thing. Now, DNA was able to get me to genus. It's a Sarcomyxa. And Sarcomyxa, we'll see a little bit later, what is a tiny genus. It only has 2 other species in it. And here's this mushroom about a month later, the same cluster, and you can see my hand up here on the side. You can get an idea of the size of this thing, but it has not yet turned buggy. Most guild mushrooms would soon be full of fly larvae and rotting away and just turning into mush. And when I told Paul Stamets about this, and Paul's very interested in mushrooms that might have insecticidal properties, and so he asked me to send him a sample, and he put a sample of this thing in cultivation. And when we cultivated it, the colors were quite different. And here's the mushroom fruiting from a block that Paul sent me, and I just set it up on my front porch at my house to take this picture. And it's not that beautiful blue on the top, but it's that gorgeous yellow underneath. Now, the question is, as anyone's guessed, can you eat this mushroom? Well, when it was just a baby, smaller than these little ones here, just basically primordia, I broke off one of the little clusters and I said, well, I couldn't waste it. So I sauteed it up. It cooked beautifully. The texture was incredible, nice and firm, not mushy, not slimy. It was one of the most delicious mushrooms I'd ever had. And so when it got mature, I took one of these big ones and I sauteed that up and I ate a little bit of it. And I got a tingling in my throat and a tingling on my tongue, and I got a little bit nervous. And so I decided I wasn't going to eat anymore. But why would I eat an unnamed mushroom to start with? Well, this is another Sarcomyxa. This is Sarcomyxa serotina. It used to be known as Pinella serotinus, the late oyster mushroom. And it's edible and a pretty good species. The other Sarcomyxa grows in China and is known as Sarcomyxa edulis, and it's absolutely delicious. And what I've discovered in my years of doing toxicology research, if you know the genus and you know the subgenus, and there's only one subgenus because this is a tiny one, it doesn't have 3,000 or 4,000 species like Cortinarius, it's just 3 species, it was worth the risk to see if that unknown Sarcomyxa was edible or not. It's gone from nature, it's disappeared. I'll probably never name it, but it does exist in the National Mushroom Culture Collection. So if anyone ever got interested in pursuing some of the chemical properties and figuring out why it stays so well, it doesn't rot, it isn't attacked by other molds, these are interesting questions. But there's also an interesting question about this late oyster mushroom itself. Notice the date at which I took the photograph, January 3rd, 2010. The temperature outside was 10 degrees Fahrenheit. It had been below freezing for 8 or 9 days. There was snow on the ground, and by below freezing, I really mean below 15 degrees Fahrenheit for 8 or 9 days. And yet these mushrooms were warm. They weren't frozen at all. I don't happen to much like the late oyster mushroom, so I didn't pick it and eat it, but it would have been completely edible, although I would not normally eat a frozen mushroom. I have also found king boletes at the mouth of the gorge down by Crown Point, when all the waterfalls in the gorge were frozen solid, and under the spruce trees at this church camp near Crown Point, there was a whole bunch of king boletes growing. And the big mature ones were all frozen solid, just like bricks, as was all of the mushrooms, except for 2 or 3 buttons, the young king boletes. Now, I'm talking about a button mushroom, a young baby that weighs a pound each. They were warm, unfrozen, absolutely delicious. So, in pursuing the oaks, one of the interesting finds is this Pseudoinonotus dryadius. It's about 3 feet in diameter. It has a white spore print, and here you can see the spores dusting underneath the mushroom. And it's an annual. It just grows 1 year. It's very, very woody, but it dies. But it'll take a few years for the mushroom itself to completely decay. So you can find it again and again. And then this is a younger Pseudoinonotus dryadius that was growing alongside my driveway last summer. And then this thing labeled a mystery polypore, I thought was going to be the same thing. It's growing right outside my office window. In fact, if it was light out, I could see it right now from where I'm sitting. And yet when I cut it open, it looks very much, they look the same. See the brown, the solid brown inside, the underside, they both bruise brown, look about the same, except that the mystery polypore has brown spores and a brown spore print. So it's obviously a very different species. I found absolutely nothing like it in the literature. So I sent this mystery polypore off for DNA analysis. I'm still waiting to find out what it might have been, if it's a known thing or something entirely new. But it was growing on oaks. So it's part of my oak Cortinarius research, where I'm finding a number of things, mostly Cortinarius under oaks, but there are some other interesting things under the oaks here in the gorge. And that's one of the special things about where we live in the Columbia River Gorge, is our oak ecosystem. It's a rare and endangered ecosystem in Cascadia. And at least on my own land, I have 10 acres of oaks, and that I cut down the firs so that to release the oaks and preserve them and preserve the western gray squirrels and other things associated with those oaks. And this is a mushroom that I thought was another Pseudoinonotus dryadius, but it was a little different in overall coloration. And all 3 of these images are exactly the same thing. And it's white spored, and that was good. But when I cut it open and took a look at it, it turns out this is a perennial mushroom. It doesn't grow just 1 year and die. It grows year after year on the same tree and gets bigger and bigger. And it turned out to be Fomitoporia fissurata based on the DNA. This is a mushroom we had no idea grew anywhere on the West Coast until I found it under the oaks. So some of the things we find are things that grow elsewhere in the world, but hadn't been identified before. Other things that I'm finding in the gorge are entirely new to science, or at least new to me from time to time. This is one of the mushrooms I really like, Oreoboletus flavoporus, another oak associate. It's beautiful chestnut color on top, and this just electric yellow sponge underneath. Now, it's as a bolete, and anything with sponge underneath, where if you rub your finger on the sponge comes off, that's a bolete. They're soft, and the sponge is soft, and the sponge just peels right off away from the cap. But this mushroom it's edible, but it's slimy. And so it's not a desirable mushroom, but very, very striking. And it's something you won't see except here in the gorge and possibly some areas in southern Oregon and into California. Now, also in the oaks is just this incredible mushroom, Butyria boletus quercy-regius. Butyria meaning butter. It's called butter bolete because the flesh is yellow, the cap is yellow, it looks very buttery. It is an incredibly delicious mushroom. The two images are exactly the same specimen. I just pulled it out of the ground, laid it on its side and photographed it. It bruises blue. Now, blue bruising in guild mushrooms is a sign that you might have a mushroom containing psilocybin and psilocin. But in a bolete, it just means you have this particular chemical called boletol, and the bluing has nothing to do with hallucinogenic properties that you would find in some guild mushrooms. But Butyria boletus, and Butyria again meaning butter, quercy-regius, quercy for oaks, regius for queen, or regal, you can view it either way. An absolutely delicious mushroom. And the one in the center there probably weighed 4 or 5 pounds for that single mushroom. And it would serve a nice meal for 3 or 4 people. Just one of these butter boletes. They're not common, and they should start appearing though under the oaks in another week or two, and will appear throughout November. And if we don't get really hard freezes, on into December, you can find this lovely choice edible under the oaks. Butyria boletus quercy-regius, a butter bolete. Now, my favorite boletes, however, are the king bolete groups, and anything that still has the name boletus is related to the king bolete, Boletus edulis, shown down here in this lower image. And I have found Boletus edulis, again, weighing several pounds each. A lot of them, though, typically maybe weigh 1/4 to 1/2 pound. The fly maggots love them. They get wormy very quickly, so you've got to find them fast. The characteristics of the king bolete group are the sponge is white when it's young, and you can't even see the tubes at first. They say the tubes are stuffed with this white material, but as the mushroom gets a little older, the sponge will darken to either this more amber color or typically to an olive green color. The top of the stem is netted like a fish net. It has a fish net pattern. And that would be true of all of the mushrooms on this image. Boletus burroughsii is probably the tastiest of the king bolete relatives. And it's more associated with the drier habitats, but it can occur both under hardwoods and under conifers. But Boletus burroughsii is sort of white to tan, just incredibly delicious. Fibrulosus, very delicious. It's the least tasty of the bunch, but I wouldn't pass it up. Very distinctive. You can see the netting on it. If we could see the underside and it was young, the underside would start out white. A little bit more color to it than the edulis itself. Then there's Boletus mautii. Here you can see an underside, and you can clearly see the netted pattern that is typical of the Boletus edulis group. And mautii has a very reticulated cap and a folded, wrinkled-looking cap. And Boletus reginius down here is the queen bolete. The queen bolete typically starts fruiting about mid-October. That's just about the king bolete, by the way, the Boletus edulis over here, starts fruiting actually sometimes in mid-July, and by October, though, is coming towards the end of its fruiting. Well, you can sometimes find it into the 1st of November, but by then I'm down at lower elevation looking for the queen boletes. The king boletes grow at all elevation under spruce, and the queens grow at lower elevations under both hardwoods and conifers. And whoops, went too fast. And here are the chanterelles that are common. We have Cantharellus roseocanus, which is associated with spruce trees. So you find it in the spruce fir zone right on the coast, and you find it above 3,000 feet here around Mount Adams, Mount Hood. It starts with a rosy blush on the top. And so the whole top is kind of this frosted, like the margin of the one that I'm pointing at here. but the underside, it isn't gills like a gilled mushroom. It's these broad forking ridges. And so it has very, very bright colored, broad forking ridges, where Cantharellus cascadensis, the cascade chanterelle, has very white forking ridges, much like Cantharellus subalbidus, the white chanterelle. In fact, subalbidus and cascadensis are closely related, but cascadensis, which starts out white when it's still buried, white on top, very quickly turns this really intense, beautiful yellow on top. And Cantharellus formosus is this more subdued egg colored. And it turns out we actually have 4 different species that look like Cantharellus formosus. So we add the word group to specify that there's not just a single species there. But when it comes to eating them, let's see, cascadensis is my favorite. It's the most delicious. Formosus, you can sometimes find 5 gallons really easy in a single patch. Delicious, cooks well, keeps well. Don't dry it and keep it because it turns into a brick when you dry it, which is true of all of the chanterelles. Cantharellus subalbidus has good flavor, but it's hard to clean because dirt tends to get embedded in the cap, where the dirt and needles wipe right off the formosus group. And it's pretty easy to clean up Cantharellus cascadensis and Rosea canis to eat. And Rosea canis is my least favorite, but it's still a very, very good mushroom that beats the pants, as far as I'm concerned, off anything you can buy in the store in terms of the button mushrooms, the various agaricus, portobellas, creminis, whatever you want to call them. They're all the same species of the button mushrooms. And then we have some things that aren't true chanterelles, but have the same kind of blunt forking ridges on the underside. And 2 that I'm particularly interested in are Polyozellus atraagilinus in the upper left corner and Polyozellus mary margaretii in the lower right-hand corner. At maturity, these 2 are very, very hard to distinguish. In almost all books, they appear as Polyozellus multiplex. But that's a much paler mushroom that grows in New York and up in Newfoundland. We don't actually have multiplex out here. We have 3 different of these blue chanterelles, but they're actually in the Telephoreales group. They're not at all related to a chanterelle. They just evolved to look a lot like a chanterelle. They're edible. They're not incredible, but they're fabulous for dye mushrooms. Now, if we drop down here to Gomphus clavatus, it has a distinctive lavender color to the blunt forking ridges on the underside. This is actually very closely related, not to other chanterelles, but to Ramarias, to the coral fungi. And Gomphus clavatus is very, very quickly invaded by worms. It's supposed to be good to eat, but I've never found it when it isn't wormy, so I've never eaten it. But I saved the best for last. Craterellus calicornicopioides, generally known in most books as Craterellus cornucopioides, but it turns out again that what we have out here in the West is not the same as the Eastern cornucopioides, so we add the calicornicopioides, the California version. Now, Craterellus calicornicopioides is black. It is only associated with oaks. Now, I don't know if you notice anything or slightly wrong with this picture regarding to what I just said. A, it's not black, and B, there's not an oak leaf in sight. It was growing under firs. I found this a mile from my house a couple of years ago. I was absolutely certain I had a new species. Noah Siegel, the California mushroom expert, was positive I had a new species. We ran the DNA. It's an exact match to the black trumpet of the Southern Oregon coast and the Northern California coast. And I have found the black trumpets within walking distance of my house here. In fact, I had a commercial mushroom picking friend and dropped over to his house one, and he picked probably 20 pounds of these calicornicopioides things, the black ones. But this thing is same species, just looks different. So sometimes you can have unusual color morphs that'll throw you, but normally something this different habitat, different color, would have turned out to be a different species. It didn't. Why I'm particularly interested in it, this is one of the most delicious of all morels, extremely good texture. When it dries, it becomes rather truffle-like in flavor, and it's an incredible mushroom to eat. I've only eaten it once. I'm looking forward to finding it. I'll be searching hard for it. It should be showing up in about November. The Polyozellus species are fruiting right now. They're coming towards the end of their season. The Gomphus clavatus is right in mid-season as we speak. Now we'll move to the guild mushrooms. And this is where things get really tricky for identification, where you have to be fairly skilled to make sure you don't make a mistake. Especially, you need to learn how to identify the Amanitas. And that's the most important thing to learn when you're looking at a guild mushroom and thinking about eating it. Amanita calyptroderma on the left is edible, not incredible. But Amanita phalloides to the right is deadly poisonous. It's far more delicious than the calyptroderma too. But as people, more than one person has told me, unfortunately, that person was on their deathbed, that it was the most delicious mushroom meal they had ever had. You don't want to have that delicious last mushroom meal. And so watch out for mushrooms that have white gills, a white spore print, and when they're young are completely covered by a universal veil, a veil that covers the whole mushroom. And so this mushroom actually, when it's whole, and before I cut it in half, looks kind of like a puffball. But you cut it open from top to bottom, you see the developing gills, the developing cap, you know it's not a puffball, you know you've got an Amanita. And Amanita ocreata is also an incredibly delicious, incredibly deadly Amanita. And then Amanita obconicobasis, I found this down by the Spring Creek fish hatchery a couple of years ago. In that, there's a little park where people do a lot of windsurfing and sailing. I thought I'd found Amanita ocreata. I haven't actually found ocreata any farther up the gorge than about Stevenson. It's more out towards the ocean, and it's a low elevation hardwood species. I don't know anything about obconicobasis. It's only been found once before down in Southern California. And so it's a new species. It's not even officially named yet, but it could easily be mistaken for Amanita ocreata. And there's no way I'm going to try and find out if it's edible or not. And there's no way I'm going to eat an Amanita calyptroderma. It just looks too similar to an Amanita phalloides. Oh, I'm sorry. And then we get to Amanitas that have a universal veil, but they don't have a partial veil on the stem. The stem itself is bare. If the vulva is constricted at the bottom and flares at the top, you have the Amanita constricta or a similar mushroom. This is a mushroom that I found up at 4,000 feet, and a few other people have found it. It's not named yet. That's what the nom prov means. It's Latin for nomen provisorium, a provisional name, and Amanita pachycolia. Now these Amanitas, these three are all edible, not all that delicious, but again, they're too similar to the deadly mushrooms. Some of these Amanitas can have very much the same color as the Amanita phalloides, which by the way can be white, green, bronze, a range of colors. And again, these mushrooms can have a range of colors. And people have thought they were eating a vaginata, and these are all called vaginata group Amanitas, and mistakenly have eaten Amanita phalloides. So learn the Amanitas. They're easy to recognize. They're soft flesh. Some of the most delicious mushrooms in the world are Amanitas, but it's too dangerous, as far as I'm concerned, to mess with them. Now, I've got a new name for our Amanita muscaria. What I call Amanita muscaria variety Flavivulvata. Flavivulvata because the vulva has a slight yellow cast to it, and these little warts are the remains of the universal veil. And so I thought those is Amanita muscaria variety Flavivulvata, and if we were in California, it would probably be that. But in the rest of North America, when you do the DNA, the mushroom turns out to look like an Amanita muscaria, and muscaria typically has 3 to 4 rings of tissue down at the base of the stem. The stem is bulbous. It has a partial veil that covers the gills, and it'll leave a ring on the stem. And these warts rub right off. So in rainy weather, you'll sometimes see this mushroom completely clear, just a nice yellow on the top. And this vulva might be underground. And if you just cut the mushroom off without seeing the vulva, you won't even have a clue you've got an Amanita until too late. Now, this group of mushrooms, Amanita aprica, grows in the spring. Amanita alpinicola is another spring mountain mushroom. And Amanita, the muscaria group, I'll just call it a group, is fruiting quite abundantly right now and will fruit clear through into December. It fruits at all elevations, in all habitats, under all different kinds of trees. Some mushrooms are highly specific to the trees, but these aren't. So what's particularly interesting about this Amanita versus the others, it has a different toxin. It has, the toxin is mucimol, and the other toxin is ibotenic acid. And they cause changes in size perception, changes in time perception. So this is the mushroom of Alice in Wonderland. This is the mushroom that's frequently illustrated on ornaments around the house. They say the colors of Santa Claus come from a red-capped Amanita, and the red and white of Santa Claus is an Amanita symbolism. But this is the mushroom Lewis Carroll wrote about, and it's perfectly legal to pick and eat this mushroom for the mind-altering effects. Don't do it. This is incredibly dangerous. It can put you into a coma-like sleep that might last 12 hours. If you eat too much mushroom, it can last up to 70 hours. And in extreme cases, there's been just 1 or 2 deaths worldwide in the last 150 years, but it is possible to kill yourself on this mushroom if you eat a lot. But it's real easy to wind up in the hospital with a massive bill. In one case, talk about going up to this next mushroom here. This is Amanita pantheranoides. This is the same toxins as the Amanita muscaria. The difference in having a rolled color cap, a rolled vulva, just one roll rather than 3 or 4 bands of tissue. It has the ring on the stem, the white gills. The gills are free from the stem, and the warts on the cap again wipe off. And Amanita gemata looks a lot like the color of that muscaria group I showed before, but the warts are different and the vulva is different. It has the rolled color vulva, but pantheranoides has exactly the same toxins as Amanita muscaria. And those toxins are water soluble. So you could boil this mushroom a couple times, throw away all of the water, and then you can eat it safely. I do not recommend that. In the case I'm thinking about, a couple in Centralia, Washington, cooked this mushroom up, and they used the water to make their spaghetti. So they had a spaghetti with mushroom sauce and nice mushroom liquid. And the neighbors heard all this noise coming from the house. They rushed over. The 2 adults were just out of their minds, literally. They were breaking up furniture, knocking over lamps, and the house was just a wreck. They got hustled into the car, taken to the hospital. While they were at the hospital, their son came home, saw dinner at the table, ignored the fact that the house was literally destroyed. And the neighbors got home just in time to take the son to the hospital as well. So this is an example of a mushroom that the feds don't mind you eating at all, but you shouldn't eat it. It's not a trip you want to take. Now, the mushroom on the left is yet another Amanita. This is Amanita sylvicola. Amanita smithiana, I'm sorry. And Amanita smithiana has yet a different toxin. And the toxin in this mushroom shuts down your kidneys. And if you eat this mushroom, you will wind up in the hospital, and you might be there for 2 or 3 months on kidney dialysis. You're not going to die. Your kidneys will eventually recover, and you will be released successfully. And what do they mistake it for? People mistake it for Tricholoma murrellianum, white matsutake. Now, white matsutake, if the veil is completely intact and not at all broken, like in this case, can fetch $100 per mushroom in Japan. And it's a highly prized mushroom in Asian culture. So it's really important to be able to tell the poisonous Amanita smithiana from the edible and desirable and choice and expensive Tricholoma murrellianum. Now on the East Coast, we have a mushroom that looks just like it, and that's Tricholoma magnivelare, which is what we used to call our mushroom. In both cases, the bottom of the mushroom is pointed, but in the Amanita, there's a big bulb before the point. And in the matsutake, the stem is widest at the top, gets narrower, narrower, narrower to a point in the ground. It's an extremely dense mushroom, and you often just see the very top sticking up, and all the rest is underground. And how do you pick one of these things? When you see one, you put your hands down on the top and you rock it in a circular fashion until it breaks loose, and then you pull it straight up. And now, the Amanita smithiana will tend to be standing taller. It'll be more obvious, but there's one other trick that's really important in safely telling it. The matsutake has incredibly dense flesh. You can lay the stem in the palm of your hand and press down with your thumb. Press down hard on either one and nothing will happen. Press with all your might and the Amanita smithiana will explode and break. If you press with all your might on the Tricholoma murrellianum, unless it's wormy, it will not break. And the other thing is slice the cap off at the top of the stem with a knife. And when you do that, the knife will squeak. This is the only mushroom that I know of that squeaks when you cut it. This Amanita smithiana will not squeak. There's one other mushroom that I thought might squeak when you cut it, and I found it when we were out with Sarah a week ago, and so I did the knife test on it. It doesn't squeak. So I can say reliably that the Tricholoma murrellianum is the one that squeaks. And so the other way you identify it is by smell. It has a smell that David Aurora has described as a cross between cinnamon red hots and dirty gym socks. And it's a love it or hate it aroma. It can be absolutely intoxicating, but if it gets a little too old or a little bit hasn't been cooked well, cooked right, it's not good to eat. And the other thing is the Tricholoma murrellianum has water soluble, so you want to not cook it in oil. The flavors come out best using it like cooking it in a rice cooker with rice and cooking with water. You don't cook it at all like you cook other mushrooms. And the other thing that fascinates me about mushrooms are the medicinal mushrooms. And of the medicinal mushrooms, the one that I'm most excited about is turkey tail, Termetes versicolor. And I chose these 4 images just to give you a range of the different looks that a turkey tail can have. But what's common about every single turkey tail is when you turn it over and you look at the bottom side, it's white with tiny little pores. And unlike a bolete, those pores do not rub off. And the mushroom is very, very thin and it's somewhat leathery. It's very flexible. So if you've got some thick polypore, and this is a polypore, it's not going to be a turkey tail. If it doesn't have the little white tubes underneath, it's not going to be a turkey tail. But the turkey tail is a very, very beautiful mushroom. And I think it shows tremendous potential for use as an adjunct therapy in treating any solid cancer, breast cancer and prostate cancer in particular. I'm very excited about turkey tails. It's still by guess and by golly, not enough research has been done, but the mushroom is safe to eat in capsule form. It's too tough to eat other than you could make a tea from it and drink the tea, or you can grind it and take a capsule. And I actually buy purchased capsules from Fungi Perfecti for my turkey tails. So what do false turkey tails look like? If you turn this thing from the top, the sternum looks a lot like a turkey tail, but the underside, that's smooth. There's no little pores. Or if you take a look at this thing on the underside here, it has teeth, it has pores, but they're a little bit teeth-like, and they're not white. They're a different color. That's a false turkey tail. Trimetopsis cervinia. We had no idea this grew in Washington State until I found it about a half a mile from my house a year and a half ago, just in time to fit it into the book. But from the top, it looks a lot like a turkey tail. You turn it over and it has these jagged teeth on the underside. Or Trichaptum abietinum, again, looks a little like a turkey tail from the top, but the underside has this sort of violet and jagged teeth, not the nice round teeth that you would find in a turkey tail. And I get excited about polypores because some of them can be really huge. And my favorite and the largest fruiting body, not the largest organism in the world. There we're talking about the plant that's in the ground and how big it is. But the largest fruiting body is Brygioporus nobilissimus. And Jim Goon was a student of mine and now works for Fungi Perfecti with Paul Stamets. And this is a photograph. The main photograph was taken by Paul, and the one on the side was taken by Jim Goon. This is a young Brygioporus. This mushroom can live, once it fruits, 50 to 100 years. It's incredibly rare to find one. I have searched and searched and searched for 50 years looking for it. It's known as fuzzy sandosius. It's one of its common names. I have yet to find one. And yet, it's one of the most common mushrooms in the forest. It only fruits on noble firs, but if you look at the leaves and needles of a wide range of trees in our coniferous forests and even in our deciduous forest, you will find the DNA of Brygioporus nobilissimus. So here's a common fungus that almost never fruits, and so it's the fruiting body that's rare and unusual. And the green that you see in this is algae growing on top. And sometimes you'll see trees and shrubs growing out of the top of a Brygioporus. But this is the best, these are the best two photographs I've ever seen of this very rare, very neat polypore. Now, other polypores are small and edible. These are fairly soft, the Albatrellus group. And Scudager relicea was once considered an albatrellus. And we have one of our common ones is this beautiful, beautiful blue Albatrellus floodii. And in time, it fades, and then it looks like what we call Albatrellus confluens. But I can see just a little bit of the blue, so I know this is just a faded floodii. But the real surprise came to me after my book was published. Last May, I got the DNA results of our Albatrellus floodii, and it's identical to the European Albatrellus confluens. In other words, but in Europe, it's never blue, not a hint of blue. It's always this sort of orangey and white coloration with a white underside. These are, when they're young, they're edible. They're a little bit tough. You could soften them up with a pressure cooker. They have decent flavor. So you can eat any Albatrellus you want. You can eat Scudager. They're okay, and probably quite good for you, actually. And then there's the woody polypores. And Fomitopsis officinalis, agaricon, is one of the very prominent and important medicinal mushrooms. The coastal Native Americans who buried their dead, often they didn't bury them, they put them in canoes and put them up in trees, and they did above ground burials. And mushrooms often fruited up around the bodies. And so the Native Americans on the coast, at least, tended to associate mushrooms with death. Now, when you get farther south, down into Southern Oregon, into California, they didn't have the same burial traditions, and they did not associate mushrooms with death. And so they ate mushrooms. But our coastal Native American tribes mostly did not eat mushrooms. But these, the agarikon, the Fomitopsis officinalis, was very popular. They would carve talismans, and the medicine men would use this mushroom in their medicine kit. Fomis fomentarius, known as amadou, is a really neat medicinal polypore that it was used by Stone Age people and by early Bronze Age people in Europe. And in Europe, even today, they take the center of this mushroom. It's a solid, hard, woody conch on the outside, but they take the center and pound it out and felt it, and they make this very, very soft, supple, leather-like material and turn it into hats, purses, and wallets. And in addition, Fomis fomentarius, that pulpy material, before you pound it out, if you have your fire going at night and you're going to be changing your camp in the morning, you just put a little ember of that fire and wrap it up in the Fomis fomentarius, and then put it in a leather pouch and carry it all day long. And then at the end of the day, you can take that ember out after you've laid your fire and start a new fire. So this was a very, very important mushroom to people prior to matches, for example. And Ganoderma oregonense is closely related to reishi, which has a long history as a medicinal mushroom. It's an annual species. And what got me started mushrooming was a gift of a small bag of morels. When I was in graduate student, my wife and I had just gotten married. She's another chemistry graduate student. I've never had any training in biology at all, by the way. I had a 9th grade biology class. Somebody gave us some morels in early summer. We cooked them up and ate them, and they were so incredibly delicious. They tasted like steak. They had a texture like steak. I compared them to a really good prime rib steak or a really good New York steak, and I was hooked from then on. And I was out hunting. I was out fishing on the Elwha River a couple months later. The fall morels were the fall mushrooms were just starting, and my wife and I picked 4 grocery bags of these beautiful red mushrooms with these whitish dots all over the cap. And we took them into the chemistry department at the University of Washington and showed them around. Nobody had a clue what we had. And I eventually found out we had Amanita muscaria, the Amanita muscaria group at least, the Alice in Wonderland mushroom. And so I signed up for an evening class, non-credit adult education class with Dr. Daniel Stuntz, and it was mushroom love from there on in. So every single good edible mushroom, morel that I know of in the Northwest is in the book. Morchella brunea is one of my favorites. It's associated with hardwoods. Morchella populophylla gets the populophylla name because it's usually under cottonwood trees. I found these, I've only found them once in my life. In fact, it's an unusual enough mushroom that there was no date on whether it was edible or not. So I had to take these 4 home. I saved a little bit for science and ate the rest. And I can report to you that this is an incredibly delicious, very, very meaty morel, wonderful texture. And what's unique about it is morels, as you come down the cap, the bottom of the cap is attached to the stem. If you cut it open from top to bottom and lay it open, it's completely hollow inside. The stem does not continue up to the top. Now in the Morchella populophylla, there's a deep sulcus. The stem doesn't go all the way to the top, but it almost does. And so this is a rather different morel from all of the other morels, and it's called a half-free morel. And Morchella snyderi is another incredibly delicious morel that has the unusual feature of tending to grow in significant clumps. I always find Brunia by itself. I always find Morchella eohespera by itself. It's now officially norwegiensis. Eohespera is a name that a friend of mine from Newfoundland and I coined when we named this. I found it in the Gifford Pinchot National Forest at about 3,500 feet, the same time my friend found it in Newfoundland. Now, all of the morels in this picture are what we call black morels. And what's characteristic of black morels is all the black morels on the West Coast, with the exception of the landscape morel, which is spread around by people, are different from all the black morels on the East Coast. So how could I find the same morel as my friend in Newfoundland? And we found him the same week, turned him in. And so we named it Eohespera. Eos for the god of the sunrise, Hesperus for the god of the sunset, because it was found both on the East Coast and the West Coast. And as we were doing the work to name it, we found that there were samples of it in herbaria in the Alps. It had been found in the Scandinavian countries. It's been found in Siberia. It's been found in China. This is a worldwide mushroom, but it was first named based on just a collection of 3 or 4 morels from one spot along a river in Norway. In fact, we went to Norway suspecting we had Morchella norwegiensis, but the spot no longer existed. We couldn't find norwegiensis, so we named a new mushroom. But then later, people did find the norwegiensis, showed it was the same as our mushroom. The first to name it gets the name that sticks. And so our name, which I love, Eohespera, because it talks about the very special nature of this mushroom, is lost to synonymy, but I'm going to stick to Eohespera a lot. And then Morchella schneideri, it grows in clumps. And I've seen these individual mushrooms 16 inches tall, growing in a clump of a dozen. And just above the town of Glenwood, a few years back, I spotted a commercial mushroom picking friend of mine. His car was parked in a 5-year-old clear cut. There are no mushrooms in 5-year-old clear cut. So, and I knew he always hid his car someplace and hunted mushrooms somewhere else. So I didn't pay a lot of attention, but I called him that night and asked him how the mushroom picking had been. He and a friend had picked 800 pounds of morels that day in that clear cut, that 4 or 5-year-old clear cut. And he told me to get right back up there. I called three people who'd never been mushroom hunting before, but were excited. We went up, we filled our 5-gallon buckets within an hour. We returned in a few days. I returned with a different group, and it was not quite as good, but it took us about 3 hours. But again, we filled our buckets. And a couple of weeks later, we managed to get another 5 gallons of morels out of the same patch. But by then, the folks from Glenwood had discovered what we were up to, and we had competition. But these morels can be staggeringly abundant and really exciting to find. And now these are the blonde morels. And my favorite blonde, Maggie Rogers, is holding a blonde morel, Morchella tridentina. And her name is Mary. She called herself Mary Margaret. She passed away a few years ago of Alzheimer's, but she was still alive long enough to know that I had named that Paleozelis Mary Margaretae in her honor. So that's the story there. The Morchella eximia is one of the burn morels that show up at about the same time that the morels tend to fruit, the naturals around here. They're going to fruit when the Calypso bulbosa orchids are blooming. That's or when the trilliums are starting to turn from white to pink. That's morel season. So in a burn, you find Morchella eximia and 2 exact lookalikes. Now, I know this is eximia and not one of the lookalikes, because as they were renaming eximia, I had sent samples to France. And so this exact collection was part of the renaming of Morchella eximia. It's an old name, but it had been lost to science exactly what it was. We now know it's a burn morel. And Morchella tomentosa is a very special burn morel that doesn't start to fruit until July, after all mushrooms are done fruiting and after everyone has quit hunting morels. So here's the special tip. You can find this mushroom when the moisture is sufficient all the way from the 1st of July until snow flies, and can find it in tremendous abundance. And while most burn morels fruit just 1, maybe 2 years after a burn, and especially if it's been dry the year after a burn, like it was this year, we had all those burns and we weren't allowed to go into any of them. They were all closed. But by next year, those burns will probably be open. And if it's moist, they'll have morels like mad because they didn't fruit to speak of like this year because it was too dry. Well, tomentosa will be there in those same burns starting in July and going clear until snow falls. And so it's a neat mushroom. But the tomentosa is in a special clade all by itself. It's a very unique mushroom because it grows from a big underground knot of tissue called a sclerotium. And like I say, it can grow for several years after there's been a burn. And but this one and this one and the Morchella tridentina are all what we call black morels. So a black morel, it's more the shape of the ridges. If we go up the ridges, we can go straight up the ridges. Now this morel is called a yellow morel or a blonde morel. See, the ridges are all crooked and cattywampus. And so Morchella america is in what we call the esculenta clade of the morels, and Morchella americana is found throughout North America. We've got it everywhere that you find morels, and Americana fruits when the tulips fruit. The interesting side note, Steve Trudell, who are at Mushrooms of the Pacific Northwest, had never found, a few years ago, had never found Morchella tridentina. And I, up to about 3 years ago, had never found Morchella americana, even though in the Columbia Gorge, they pick enough of it to sell it commercially every year. All I ever find is stumps, but I always get there too late or in slightly the wrong patch, but it grows along the riverbanks when the tulips are fruiting. So Steve and I go out. I'm determined to find Americana. Steve is determined to find tridentina. Well, guess what? I only found tridentina. He only found Americana. And so it was years later before I found Americana. I don't know if Steve has found tridentina yet, but I find lots of it here in the gorge. You know, the morels are ascomycetes. That is, they bear their spores inside of a sac called an ascus, where the guild mushrooms and the polypores are basidiomycetes. They bear their spores on a little club-shaped structure. There's typically 4 spores on the end of a club. Sometimes there's just 2. Sometimes there can be 8 or more. And in the sac, there's typically 8 spores in a sac, but there can be as few as 2 or as many as several hundred spores in an ascus sac. And some of these are just neat from what they look like. This is called an alder tongue. These little red things will turn darker and eventually black as they overwinter. This is not a fungus. This is the fungus causing the cone to have these misshapen growths called tongues, and the spores just appear right on the tongue. No fruiting body ever forms. But I just think alder tongues are a lot of fun to find and look at. And this Cudoniella clavis is just a little tiny mushroom, you know, maybe about the diameter of your little fingernail. And when I took the photograph, I didn't even know that there was a second species here, this Poezoloma coelifera. And indeed, Poezoloma coelifera was totally unknown from the Pacific Northwest, and I had just accidentally captured it in the photograph. I kept the stick, so I have a herbarium specimen so I can prove we've got it here. So some of the things we find are just accidental. But talking about small things, if we go down to the lower left, this is a single elk dropping. Those of you that aren't familiar with elk pellets, you know, there may be half an inch long at most and slightly oblong. So this is greatly blown up. And these yellow ones are Kyllemania stercoraria, and these white ones are Lasiobolus coniculi. And when we took this elk dropping, I just photographed it in the woods where I found it, and I took it into the lab and we started looking at it with a microscope. We found actually 5 different species of mushrooms, including a little tiny guild mushroom on this single elk dropping. And this Bisonectria cartilaginea is another rather neat and unique mushroom. The individual little orange lobes are quite small. They're maybe a tenth to maybe up to a quarter of an inch in diameter, but they grow on this paler yellow material. It's called a subiculum. It's kind of leathery. You can peel it right off the ground, and when you turn it over and look at the bottom, it's full of rodent droppings, most usually pica droppings, because this mushroom forms at the edge of a melting snowbank at high elevation, where rodents defecate in the same latrine all winter long. And then this mushroom fruits on that material, and you can find it. And there's a lookalike, Bisonectria terrestris, that when you turn it over, you don't find the pellets. It's found at lower elevations, and it's found where the rodents urinate in the same place year after year. So I get interested in mushrooms, not just to be able to eat them, but I just think this is a beautiful mushroom. And this Kyllemania stercoraria, you look at it under a microscope and it's just absolutely spectacularly beautiful. And then there's this mushrooms that when you cut them in half, you get milk. And there's the Lactarius deliciosus group on the right, top and bottom. There's a darker one and a lighter one. We found, Sarah and I found quite a few Lactarius deliciosus in the woods. We were in the woods. I've talked nonstop for 6 hours for her. So hopefully I'll finish talking in time for you guys and not run over. But I picked one deliciosus group mushroom up and turned it over, and it didn't have the gills on the underside. It had been attacked by an ascomycete and was all contorted and weird. And so it was attacked by a hypomyces. It was attacked by a mushroom related to the thing that creates the lobster mushroom, which is a parasite on a Russula brevis group. And here's a little tiny Lactarius. Here you can see how much smaller it is than my knife. Fruits by the hundreds all around my house, all around my vineyard, never been named. So this is one I'm working on naming. Lactarius rubrulacteus is very distinctive. It has a reddish milk, but not enough to give juice. This doesn't give visible juice, but has an orange milk. This has a white milk to it, this Lactarius mushroom. And Lactarius mushrooms are closely related to the Russula group. They're not related at all to other guild mushrooms. The stem breaks crisply and cleanly, because if we look at it under a microscope, it's structured it looks kind of like a chunk of styrofoam. And so Russulas are also constructed of material that looks like styrofoam. In some cases, it's very dense, like the brevis complex. This mushroom, when it gets eaten by Hypomyces lactiflorum, turns all orange. You don't see the gills. It's smooth, or at least corrugated on the underside. And you have the lobster mushroom, which a lot of people like to cook, and it's really great at taking up the flavors of whatever you cook it with. And Russulas, by the way, are notoriously difficult to identify. Years ago, I swept all the awards in a photo contest from the North American Mycological Association. And I won, as one of my prizes, this book, Mushrooms of North Africa. It was in French. It weighed about 10 pounds, this massive book, and it only covered Russulas of North Africa. And for example, Russula emetica. If you had asked me 6 months ago, I would have told you, well, emetica doesn't grow in North America, it's only in Europe. We now have the DNA back. We have it. But what color is the cap? The cap of Russula emetica can be just absolutely bright red. It can be this sort of yellowish white. It can be a combination, and everything in between. It can be pink. The gills are always a clean, bright white. The stem always breaks crisply and cleanly. And if you hold it by your ear, when you break it, you can hear it break, just like a piece of chalk breaking. And these are also known as brittle gills. You rub the gills and the gills break off in a brittle fashion. Russula fragrantissima group, we have several species in the Northwest. None of them are properly named at the moment, but they smell like a combination of almond extract and baby vomit, and they're not good to eat. Now, Russula zarampolina complex, on the other hand, is absolutely delicious. The key characteristic to identify it is this stipe, the stem, and we call it a stipe on a mushroom, will slowly bruise brown. And in the field, the mushroom, unless it's old, will not have any smell at all. But when you take it home and it warms up in a paper bag and then you sniff it, it will smell like crab or shrimp. And when you cook it, it will smell like crab or shrimp. And so how do I know that I've got a Russula that I want to take home? I look for the bruising reaction on the stem. And what color cap do I want to look for? Well, the cap can be just a electric lemon yellow. It can be almost velvety black, but it's typically a combination of purple, green, a little bit of red, and a little bit of pale. In other words, highly variable cap color, but always this slow brown bruising. It takes a minute or two to develop on the stem. And the stem also is moderately crispy. A brevipiece complex is really dense. It's hard to break the stem. An Emmetica, the stem is kind of softish and pithy, and it just sort of breaks apart when you break it. When you break this, the stem breaks very beautifully. It's firm, but not too firm, soft, but not too soft, and you've got a zarampolina. But it's the brown bruising, and when you get it home, and it's a good size mushroom. It's typically about the size of a saucer, really delicious. And you can find it in huge quantity because most people don't know how to recognize it. Most people do not eat Russula zarampolina. My favorite mushrooms of all, though, are the Hericiums. And the top two, this is Hericium ebeatus. It's called a bear's head. And this is a close-up of what it looks like, very magnified. Now, Sarah and I found 4 of them last week, but all of them were, the biggest one was about the size of a hardball. But the one here in the photograph was the size of a small bushel basket. And I have seen them bigger than a bushel basket in diameter, big enough to feed 20 people for 2 or 3 days. And if I'm teaching a quarter-long mushroom course, and I ask my students at the end of the class, what was your favorite mushroom of the whole class? They will always say Hericium ebeatus, the bear's head. A very firm mushroom. You cook it slowly till it's lightly brown. I like to cook all of my mushrooms until they're lightly brown. All mushrooms must be cooked before you eat them. They must be thoroughly cooked to be good to eat. You don't want to eat an undercooked mushroom. You don't want to eat a raw mushroom. But this one is very, very delicious and can be huge and well worth eating. They'll keep in the refrigerator for a couple of weeks after you find it. Hericium coralloides is more open, and this tends to grow on hardwoods, where the ebeatus almost exclusively is on conifers. But my very favorite Hericium is Hericium erinaceus, the lion's mane. Now, why isn't it the favorite of my students? Because lion's mane doesn't grow in Washington, quote unquote. And when I was teaching in Olympia, and you won't find a lion's mane anywhere near Olympia. However, next month, take a hike up Hospital Hill in White Salmon, or take a hike around Mosier, around the oak trees, or Hood River, or Lyle, anywhere where there's a good population of oaks. And maybe 1 in 100, 1 in 1,000 oak trees will have a lion's mane. Now, these things can weigh 10, 15 pounds per mushroom. And so you can feed a lot of people around off of one lion's mane. And the thing I like about it, it has a lobster flavor. This mushroom is easily cultivated. You can buy it in culture, and it's growing locally in Hood River, commercially. It is, I think, one of the healthiest mushrooms. Indeed, all of the hericiums are very healthy. And there's significant evidence that these things are capable of neurogeneration. And so they show considerable promise, and they've been tested in Asia in particular against Alzheimer's in a large number of people. And they do seem to slow the progression of Alzheimer's. And so people live longer and seem to be healthier. Just if they're eating mushrooms in general as a regular part of their diet, 3 or 4 times a week, just making sure that you're eating the good edible mushrooms and not a poisonous mushroom. And so I consider all mushrooms, medicinal mushrooms, when properly identified, properly cooked, and consumed. But the Erinaceus in the wild, that lobster flavor, it is so like lobster. The texture is so meaty. You literally slice it like you were slicing a ham into slices to fry for breakfast in the morning. And you slice it about as thick as you would slice a ham. You cook it till both sides are nicely brown, put a little salt on it. You add some oil and olive oil and a little bit of butter as you're cooking. Just incredibly delicious meal. And so when are you going to find Hericium erinaceus, the lion's mane? I was talking to James from Syncline yesterday. He said a few people are starting to find them already. Their main fruiting period is November. I found them into early January. So start looking. This is a low elevation mushroom. If you read the mushrooms of the Pacific Northwest book, they'll tell you they don't grow around here. Well, they do. And I've just told you how to find them. So good luck, have at it. And so here's some resources. If you want to learn how to order my book, and as I discover new species, and I have a section in my website, mushroomsofcascadia.com, where I will be adding information, adding corrections as I find corrections to the book, and there are mistakes. The second edition, I'll be clearing those up. I've got some typos here and there, and also a number of things just got named recently. Between the time I finished writing the book and finished updating all the names in, well, it was April, but by May, there were some new names to some of the things I just named. But the other reason I was able to write the book that I wrote was there's a program called MycoMatch. It's free, it's on the internet. It's a product of the Pacific Northwest Key Council. I'm a co-author. Literally, virtually all of my photographs are available if you download this free program, as are many of the photographs of Steve Trudell and all the good photographers of the Pacific Northwest. We've all contributed our photographs. There's, I think at this point, around 7,000 images available on MycoMatch. There's 4,000 species fully described, and we have photographs of about half of those fully described species. So it's a free download. Unfortunately, we're still working on figuring out how to make it work on Apple machines. That'll I would say if you're using an Apple, it's worth buying a notepad that'll operate the DOS system, and then you could use MycoMatch. And so go for it, download it. Good luck with your mushroom hunting, and that ends the program.
Awesome.
How did
Thank
we
you,
do
Michael.
time-wise?
You did perfect. But you're still going. You're not quite done yet. So don't
Well,
leave
I
it.
know, but I ran a little long, it looks like to me.
Well, that's okay. You can talk to Seth Tibbet. We let him go a long time last year. If people want to hear it, I'm happy to do it. So
Okay.
no one's coming into my office tonight. Everyone, if you haven't already and you have a question, put it in the Q&A. And I can tell you right now, do not be shy. If you are a beginner like me, your questions are just as welcomed as the many of you out there who I know are more experienced. So I will start going through questions. One of them that came up that I maybe even know the answer to, I think, is that can you determine a false chanterelle? Is it true that you can determine a false chanterelle by cutting it lengthwise? And if it's a hollow core, that's a false one. And if it's solid, that's a real one?
Well, the main false chanterelle is hollow all the way down. and it depends on what you call false chanterelles. That's where I get in, because there are some false chanterelles, like the blue chanterelles, but that aren't chanterelles at all, and they're not hollow like that. But what we're talking about here is a mushroom called Turbinellus floccosus, and it will send you to the porcelain throne rather quickly, and you'll be spending a bit of time there. So you do need to know how to identify it. Hi, Julie.
Let's see. And I've been practicing this name, so we'll see how I do. What's your culinary opinion of the Oreoboletus mirabilis?
It is a lemony flavored mushroom. It's a very distinctive mushroom, a very good mushroom for beginners. A little bit on the slimy side. I like a firmer textured mushroom, like the king bolete. I prefer to, but it's probably my second favorite bolete, and it's going to get a new name. It's not going to stay Oreoboletus because it turns out it's not. The DNA says it's not really related to other Oreoboletus, so we've got to go for a new name.
We have a question from Nora, who is 7 years old, and she wants to know if you've ever been poisoned.
Yes, several times, always with choice edible mushrooms. And so this is an important point that she brings up. You always want to eat just a little bit of any new mushroom to make sure you're not a person who's sensitive to it. Now, I have eaten mushrooms of unknown edibility and never been poisoned by them, because I've always been careful to make sure that they were in a group that I knew I could eat, and that they were closely related, that all of its relatives were good to eat, and therefore it's a good assumption, it's safe to find out. In fact, I tested one unknown Ramaria, a coral mushroom, with the whole Oregon Mycological Society group on a foray, because we found like half of a pickup load of this mushroom. And I said, well, I'm sure people have been mistakenly identifying it as this other Ramaria, which is edible. But officially this one is unknown. Let's find out. And everyone agreed to eat it. Nobody got sick. So now I can say that's an edible mushroom. But I cannot eat the prince, which is Agaricus augustus, an almond flavored agaricus. In fact, I can't eat any almond flavored agaricus. I get sick. And I can't eat Chlorophyllum rhacodes, which is dinner plate size, considered one of the choicest edible mushrooms. But for me, it's a quick trip to the porcelain throne. And so, and I've got friends who cannot eat chanterelles, and even if they're well cooked. Now, one problem with chanterelles is people often don't cook them well enough. But always eat just a little bit the first time.
And if you're
make sure you cook them.
And if you're 7, maybe ask your parents before you put a mushroom in your mouth.
And if you're younger than 7, be especially careful. You shouldn't start kids on mushrooms until they're at least 5 years old, because their digestive system is different than that of adults. And by 7, though, she's old enough to start trying mushrooms, but carefully. And there'll be some things, might even be some things that her parents can eat now, and she might not be able to right away.
When you're out collecting mushrooms, is there any advice or things that we should or shouldn't do, where if we collect too much, we might make it not able to fruit the next season, or if we collect in a wrong way, it might not be able to reproduce, or we should not collect it this year so that it, are there any sort of bits of advice around that?
Well, in general, when you look at an apple tree, do you decide to leave a few apples behind so that the tree does better? You can pick them all.
Okay.
But you don't want to go in with a rake and rake mushrooms to find all the little baby matsutakis, to find all the baby king boletes that haven't shown up yet, because that raking, you're basically ripping the tree apart. You're ripping the mushroom itself is an organism more closely related to an animal than to a plant, but it's this diverse mycelium in the ground. And if you start ripping around in the ground, you can destroy that mycelial net. And in some cases, if too many people are walking and the ground gets hard packed, the mushrooms won't do as well. But in the case of the choice edible shaggy mane mushroom, it grows right up through roads. It'll break the blacktop open and fruit right through the blacktop. I was over at a friend's house yesterday, and their driveway was full of erupting shaggy manes. I don't like them because they have a texture like an oyster and a flavor like an oyster, and I'm allergic to oysters. But if you love oysters, you'll love shaggy manes. And they're a top 10 beginner's mushroom for those that like that texture. And I once was driving down the Icefield Parkways driving from Jasper down towards Banff, and they were fruiting on both sides of the road. The woods were cleared about 100 yards back on both sides of the road, and for 20 miles it was solid, millions and millions of shaggy manes. They just were fruiting in unbelievable abundance.
We have a question going back to the photo you showed where you said it'd been freezing the night before, and here we are, we show up and I feel the mushroom and it's warm.
Yeah.
What might be going on to generate that heat?
The mushroom is actively growing, and that's the metabolism, the metabolic heat. So in the fact that the mushrooms are like an animal, we are able to generate our heat and stay warm when it's freezing out. And when I took that picture, it not only had been 10 degrees that night, it was still 10 degrees when I took the picture. It didn't get above 10 degrees. It didn't get above 15 degrees for over a week.
Will you tell, I know this is probably could be a really complicated answer. So tailor it to people like me a little bit. Describe the process of making an ID using genetic testing or DNA. Because that sounds like it's really important when you really need to hammer down on a mushroom. How are they doing that?
I've made it a point to say that I've learned enough now, and I'm not going to learn how to do that part. But basically, you take the mushroom and you treat it with a special enzyme, and CRISPR is, people have heard that name a bit, that breaks the DNA, which is a whole bunch of ATGC molecules, and those are the abbreviations for the 4 different structures that the protein is made of. It breaks it into little pieces. And then you take and separate the pieces and you figure out the order. Is it AATGC or is it A? And once you get the order, and then you have to use a computer to try and figure out how the whole thing would have been pieced back together as one single strand. So you break it into pieces, strip apart each piece, figure out the order, and then try and put it back together using computer modeling.
Go ahead.
And then there's certain parts by looking at it, we've got a sense of how fast this region of DNA changes. So we don't look at the whole molecule. We just look at a region that's come to be known as the barcode region, that's distinctive to a specific mushroom. I've got to just stand up because my leg is cramping. So I'm going to move my window.
Well, that'll give me a chance to look through. I like that you tried to pretend that you hadn't learned much about DNA sequencing. That sounded like you knew plenty. I want to, related to that, or at least to identification, someone was curious about what kind of microscope or other equipment besides the white piece of paper do you recommend for examining spores?
It's a good microscope that's capable of going to 1,000 power. In other words, an oil immersion, because the cheaper student grade microscopes only go to 400 power. And you can do a lot of ascomycetes at 400 power, but you need that additional microscope. The scope I have sitting right here by in fact, I got my hand on it, it sits right on my desk, costs about $1,000 new, and it goes to 1,250 power. So I can get a pretty good look at what the spores are. But at the University of Washington, they have much bigger scopes, much better quality, and they can see things that I can't. But I know some people in the Oregon Mycological Society who have these fancy computer hooked up scopes that can, by taking multiple images and stacking them together, get detail that I can't see with my normal microscope. So there's all kinds of different levels that you can operate at. Depends on your budget.
Are you good? Because I'll keep
fine.
asking you questions. Okay. How will climate change and the effects of logging and maybe wildfires, how is that going to potentially affect our mushrooms?
Well, I don't think it's going to matter much to us because we're going to lose us and the mushrooms both. So
Thanks, Michael. Come on.
I'm
Okay,
sorry.
before we all disappear,
Yeah.
what changes might we see?
Well, we're seeing things that used to only grow in the fall, also growing in the spring. We're seeing longer seasons, but also in the Northwest, we're seeing drier times. So we have a year like this where there's the fewest mushrooms I've seen in 50 years because it's way too dry. And then we're seeing a lot more forest fires and a lot more smoke. I mean, the truth is we're predicted to lose our entire Northwest forest, and this is going to turn into grassland country. Yeah, and that's from the global warming, combination of the global warming and the forest fires. And some people think it's not too late. I started out as an atmospheric scientist doing atmospheric chemistry in 1962. I was an atmospheric chemist. I think we've waited too long. I've been arguing for 50 years we've got to start doing something. And we're not going to. We're going to vote the Democrats out of office because they're telling us we've got to do things we don't want to do, either cut back on our oil and use more regeneration, more wind power, more solar power, which will actually generate more jobs and more money than burning fossil fuels. And the other thing people don't know about burning fossil fuels like coal, that coal plant that was burning in Nordman, the coal was cheap, but the SO2 emissions alone, we talk about the CO2 emissions causing global warming, but the SO2 emissions were acidifying the forest and cutting down the forest growth. And we actually were losing more in tree value. So the foresters should have been trying to shut down that coal plant because of the damage it was doing to the environment. Now it's been shut down for other reasons, I think, I hope, or it's shutting down. But we're putting out these pollutants that are changing our forests, and we're losing them. And if you go to Colorado, you go to Montana, you see thousands of acres of just dead standing trees. It's frightening.
Yeah, and that
And
affects, that's
here.
all connected too.
You know, I was in love with Brighton Bush, with Opal Creek Wilderness. They're gone.
Yeah. Which is a reminder, in April, we're going to have a panel discussion about our forests here. So we're going to bookend this season by
Right.
talking about forests. I want to turn to a 5-year-old's question.
Okay.
Alder wants to know what mushrooms might be good for a kid. And so he's just 5, but even like other young kids, what would be like the good, first mushroom to eat for a kid that might help get them to fall in love a little bit with him?
Well, I mean, my apps, just for routine eating and availability, the king bolete. And they're up now. You saw that photograph at the end of the table full of king boletes, the last thing in my talk. I was up in Alaska, just near the Kenai Peninsula a few years ago, and we'd done a mushroom weekend. We hadn't found a single king bolete, and then the woman from the Forest Service took me out to this little island that we waded across some logs to get onto, and it was solid king boletes. We picked 4 baskets of king boletes, and I mean big baskets, like we had 2 laundry baskets worth of mushrooms coming out of there. And we cleaned the place out because it was, was a small island. We picked everything we could see. And 2 days later, the next day we went on along the Kenai River, and we were taking somebody back who'd been at the conference and they needed a ride. And I said, well, let's drive up this logging road. We would just drive along the road. And I said, stop. And there'd be like 40 or 50 king boletes along the side of the road. And we'd drive another half a block and there'd be another 40 or 50. And we were driving a Ford Ranger. We filled it. There wasn't any room to sit in the Ford Ranger by the time we got home. So we went back to the island the next day and it was like we'd never been there. We took those mushrooms down to Cordova.
Like based on what I observed when you and I went out, like king boletes are your happy place.
Yep.
I'm curious for people who are not hunter, who don't go out mushroom hunting and maybe don't have access to even do that. Where can you get wild mushrooms? Is there like, if you don't hunt, are you out of luck, or is there some place where you can get them?
Two things. I'll sit back down again because my cramp has gone away. In Rosauers the other day, I saw chanterelles for sale, and I've seen other wild mushrooms for sale. And then there's companies that cultivate gourmet edible mushrooms. I have a lion's mane mushroom kit sitting downstairs getting ready to fruit. I have an oyster kit down there that I just fruited. I have a shiitake kit. And oh gosh, shiitakes are so good, and you don't find them in the wild at all. You have to grow them. They're one of my top 10 favorites. You take the shiitake mushroom stem is a little bit tough. You cut the stem off, you lay it on your barbecue, gills up, and then you fill the gill area with a mixture of soy sauce, lemon juice, olive oil, and a little bit of hot sauce. And you let the mushrooms cook until all that sauce has disappeared into the mushroom, and then you serve them. And it's heaven. It's heaven eating those things. And I've seen those for sale. Shiitake is often for sale at Rosauers. You find it for sale at let's see.
I've got a couple notes, maybe Columbia Gorge mushrooms, and then also maybe Blue Bus has sold some of the mushrooms at farmers market. So.
Yeah, they do that, and but also you'll see mushrooms for sale at the farm stand and mushrooms for sale at Treebird Market.
Got it.
So those would be other local places to find them, and farmers markets. People will be selling their wild harvested mushrooms in those places, and then. Well, like the Craterellus calicornucopioides, which I really am eager to eat a lot of. It turns out Far West Fungies, they're just north of San Francisco, sells them dried for $35 for 8 ounces. Now that sounds like a lot of money, but that was 8 pounds worth of fresh mushroom. And I'm going to rehydrate those and use some of those in a quiche, a mushroom quiche. And mushrooms and eggs go really well together, and quiche. And I'm very eager. So I'm buying mushrooms now from far west, and the Columbia Gorge mushrooms folks. They're really great people, and sell cultivated mushrooms. All of my, except for the oyster kit that I had been given by somebody else, they were all gifts from Columbia Gorge mushrooms folks. And I'm eager to grow those kits out. So you can grow, and that would be a lot of fun for a 5-year-old, is to get a shiitake mushroom kit, or the oyster mushroom kit is the easiest one to grow. It's my least favorite of those for eating, but the lion's mane is not too hard to grow. And it's a great eating mushroom.
Okay, I want to be thoughtful of your time, but I just want to get in a couple more questions. So
whatever you want to do, I'm yours.
Okay, then I'm going to keep going. Michael's ready to keep going. If you guys have bedtimes, obviously you can go, but I just want to keep getting him in. Are there any truffles around the gorge?
No, is what I would have said a year ago. Absolutely yes, is what I say now. because a former neighbor called me and said, "Hey, I found these truffles at Northwest, at the old, just above the old Northwestern Lake site." And I said, "Truffles only grow as far inland as Stevenson. You'll find them there because they're all associated with the coastal strain of Douglas fir, the good edible truffles." Now, we have truffles all over the gorge that aren't delicious edibles. We probably have 150 different species or 200 species, maybe 300 species of truffles. But there's only 5 that are really good eating, and they're all in the genus tuber. So I went down there to this guy's place and I said, "Okay." And I looked and I said, "Oh my God, that's tuber gibbosum. That's worth $800 a pound." If it had been ripe, they weren't ripe. You need a dog to hunt truffles because an unripe truffle doesn't have any taste. The dogs only dig up the perfectly ripe ones. I went on one guided truffle trip once in my life. There were 8 of us on the trip. We got 16 ounces of truffles for our guided tour. We had 2 truffle dogs. And it cost about $1,200. Now that sounds like a lot of money for a pound of truffles. But I used the truffles to flavor whole avocados, whole raw eggs, butter, hard cheeses, soft cheeses, and especially Asiago cheese, but butter and eggs. And then you just leave you put it in the refrigerator for 2 days in a gallon container, all sealed up. I put 1 ounce of truffle in 1 gallon container and another ounce. So each of us got 2 ounces. So I got 2 gallons worth of food in 2 days, all truffle flavored. Took that out, put the truffles in a fresh paper towel, put them back in the refrigerator for 2 more days, and did it again. I did it a 3rd time. At that time I had to wait for 3 days because things were slowing down. And, but I got, I don't know, several pounds of butter, several pounds of truffle cheese. And then I just froze the cheese and the truffles that were left and the truffles were all still left. So then I'd have breakfast with truffled eggs. I'd make toast and use truffled butter on the toast. And then I'd shave a little truffle on top for good. And for our wedding anniversary in June, months after, this was in the end of January that we'd found the truffles, but in June for our anniversary, I just cooked a bunch of pasta, shaved 1 whole truffle onto the pasta, added some truffle butter and truffle cheese. And that was dinner. That's all we had for dinner. And it was 2 years before we'd eaten all the truffled butter and truffle cheeses.
So
it's cheap.
It was worth it.
It was worth it.
Okay, let's see. We've done these. What about eating mushrooms and drinking alcohol together?
I always drink alcohol with
okay,
my
I did. Okay, that's so not.
But some people can't.
Okay.
And you do not want to eat the mushroom called Tippler's bane, which is it used to be Coprinus atramentarius. I'll use that name. It's now, I think, Coprinopsis atramentaria, but it's also known as an inky cap. It's related to it looks kind of like a shaggy mane, except it's not shaggy and it's not as long in the cap. And you can drink as much alcohol as you want up to the minute that you eat the mushroom. In other words, you can have cocktails before dinner, but if you're eating that mushroom for dinner and you drink alcohol after eating some of the mushroom, your heart will start racing, your face will flush, you'll feel very sick and very unhappy. And this will happen for as long as a week after you've eaten the mushroom. So I never eat that mushroom. And people thought, well, heck, if it does that to you, it'd be a good substitute for Adibuse to keep alcoholics off the bottle. So they tested it on male beagles. I don't know why they only use male beagles, but they found significant testicular damage in the male beagles. So even aside from the alcohol, I'm not eating that mushroom.
Let's see. Someone wrote in about getting puffballs, slicing them and frying them up. I think you and I talked some about about
Right.
this kind of eating.
Yeah.
And she said she found one that was new to me. It was on Surveyor's Ridge called lycoperdon. You guys are doing this to me on purpose. It was called
Lycoperdon,
echinaton or
echinacea,
spiny puffball. That's
the
the kind of
spiny
name
puffball.
I
Yeah,
can get. I can get down with that name. Have
yeah,
you
that's
seen
fun.
those? Have you seen those around?
Yeah, they're out there. They're small. They're nondescript. The ones I like to eat are at least as big as they got to be bigger than a softball before I'm tempted.
And how do you cook those?
Well, I slice them about the same slice as a slice of bread that you'd be making French toast out of in the morning. Well, actually, a standard bread slice, not as thick as some people slice their French toast, but a standard bread slice if you bought like Wonder Bread at the store, which fortunately they don't sell anymore because it's a wonder that anybody can eat it. But I then dip the mushroom slices in my egg batter like I was going to make French toast, and then I cook it in a skillet just like French toast and serve it with maple syrup. Delicious.
I like it.
But if the mushroom isn't big enough to slice like a piece of bread, I'm not interested. And the puffball, you'll have to cut them through the middle from top to bottom. It's critical that it looks like a marshmallow inside and feels like a marshmallow. There are false puffballs called earth balls. When you cut them open, they can be pure white still inside, but they'll be firm. They won't be soft like a marshmallow. And
go ahead.
And also you got to make sure you don't have an amanita. But if you cut that, you would see the developing gills and cap and all that inside. So it, like I say, it's got to just look like a marshmallow. It's got to feel like a marshmallow. It won't be sticky like a marshmallow, but it'll be the texture of a marshmallow.
If someone said, okay, tomorrow, Michael, you're going to have to give up one piece of why you love mushrooms. Like if I think of you, like I think you love mushrooms because you love to eat them in so many forms. I think you love mushrooms because the hunt and the mystery and the discovery is so fun. So if they said, okay, you've got it tomorrow, you can either eat mushrooms for the rest of your life, but not go hunt for them. Or tomorrow you can keep hunting and making these discoveries, but you're not going to be able to eat them anymore. Which would you pick?
Oh, that's a tough one. You're going to live longer if you eat mushrooms, but you're going to be a lot happier if you could go hunt them. I don't want to make that choice. I'm not going to do that.
Okay.
I'm not going to go down
All right.
that
Well,
road.
since you're the guest, I'm going to let you off easy on that one. Someone's asking why doesn't the matsutake grow in the Northwest? But it does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Okay. So maybe that was just a.
Well, it's interesting though. What she might have confused it with when people thought the lion's mane didn't grow in the Northwest. Because it's only here in the gorge and down in Southern California. It's not all over the Northwest. But we have lion's mane. But matsutake, until I retired, I would be lucky if I found one or two a year. And then I realized that they rarely are sticking up above the ground. They form mushrooms. They just push the ground up a bit. Or sometimes you'll just see the crown of the mushroom showing through. And I see something from Krista there about hen of the woods. We don't have hen of the woods here.
Okay,
it's an eastern mushroom. But
maybe she was thinking maybe that was what was meant. So maybe just saying it was, how come the hen of the woods doesn't grow out here?
I don't know.
Okay.
The hen of the woods is associated with specific eastern hardwood trees. We have different trees and therefore we have different mushrooms. We do have a mushroom that looks like hen of the woods a bit, and it's associated with conifers, and it doesn't taste good at all. So there is a hen of the woods like thing here. It has bigger fronds. The hen of the woods has small fronds. Now, hen of the woods is a good mushroom to cultivate, and it's a good mushroom to grow. And I don't know if the Columbia Gorge mushroom folks cultivate that one or not, but it is popular cultivated and a good edible. Oh, and Krista says, yes, they do cultivate it. So
We will try to grab some of we've seen just some information URLs put in the chat, and then some of the stuff that Michael shared in his talk. We will add those back to our webpage where this is all listed. So if you missed something tonight and you're wondering what that was, we'll get that listed there. Let's do 2 more, and then I'm going to have you get to go to bed and say goodnight. Real quick, before we do those last 2, next month we have Dr. Jocelyn Akins, who is a wildlife biologist who is one of the very few studying 2 really, really unique, amazing carnivores in our North Cascades. So I hope you will join us again next month for that. And then last thing here, I want to find out, let's see, someone asked, with wildflowers, 25% got new names after we started doing DNA identification. What has happened with the mushrooms? Has that same sort of change happened? And are there the splitters and the lumpers, which I know you talked about?
Yeah. We're probably going to exceed 25% getting new names. and when I was down at Harvey Mudd College for my 50th reunion, that's where I did my undergraduate work and my first teaching job. I was talking to a specialist in coral mushrooms, and I was mentioning how many new species we're discovering now that we're looking at DNA. This is the same is true of corals in the ocean. We're finding massive more species than we thought existed. These 2 things look alike, but they aren't. Or we have things on the West Coast that look the same as the thing on the East Coast, but when you look at the DNA, they're not related.
That's amazing.
And so we're finding more and more of that all the time. And that's why, I even collected meadow mushrooms from my yard last year. The Agaricus campestris is what it's called, because it turns out nobody has yet looked at the DNA of the meadow mushroom in the Northwest. And we're actually pretty sure we don't have Agaricus campestris. We got something else. I don't have an answer yet because it turns out the guy didn't have the money to actually send the stuff in for DNA last fall. And it's not going in till this month. So I'm gonna have to wait another year before I get an answer to what our meadow mushroom really is. So sometimes I'm out looking at very, very common mushrooms, things we thought we knew well. And sometimes I'm looking at things like I've never seen before. And every time I've gone out this year, I've found something I've never seen before, except the trip with you, where I found something I'd seen once before, but not on that particular species, not at all like what we found. It looked very different because it was a parasite, but it was parasitizing a different mushroom. But I'd only seen that particular parasitism once, where the lobster you find all the time. That parasite is common.
That's how it happens.
Yeah.
Looking ahead, I know we talked some about this when you and I went on a hike. Do you see any more field classes that you're going to be leading in the future?
Well,
or do you want to? How should we? Let me reframe that. How can we twist your arm into?
Well, I've been teaching a course for Mount Adams Institute every other year. We meet at the ranger station at Trout Lake, and then we go up in the woods after a talk, and we go hunt mushrooms. And I thought we were going to be doing that this fall, or at least doing a live Zoom. And I do both, actually. I'm easy, but yeah, I'll be doing more. And there was a private conference just a couple of weeks ago that at least Krista Cushman and Rachel Zoller were both at and led for. There were several people leading forays there, really great people. They're doing the classes. There's a class this Saturday on dye mushrooms. I'm going to pop in. I'm not leading it. I'm not officially going to be there, but I'm going to show up. They'll start in Trout Lake at the gas station. And so
there's classes out there. And I think, yeah,
and I think Krista is the mycologist for that particular class. And I know Rachel is teaching classes. So we have several people out there. Not just me. I'm now taking care of my wife, so I have to take over the cooking and the cleaning, as well as, and we've got 32 acres, an orchard and a vineyard, and I've got the outside work, the inside work. So I rarely go mushroom hunting myself anymore.
Yeah.
That trip with you, but I didn't have time this week to go out, but I will sneak out on Saturday because I want to see Krista again and I want to see Julie Beeler because they're the two involved in that particular class. So there's mushrooms for art as well, arts and crafts, which is something we didn't touch on much, but I do touch on it in my book. The mushrooms that are really good for making fabric dyes, for dyeing silks, for dyeing woolens, dyeing linen.
I'm sorry, I got the throat tickle too.
I have the
All right,
same.
that's a
problem.
sign. I think that's a sign. You and I both have it.
Yeah.
Michael, you have been awesome. Thank you for taking the time. For anyone who is here and curious, I'm going to be putting together an episode of the Here in the Gorge podcast, a short one that will share a little bit of my time going out with Michael and some of his crazy stories and some of the stuff we found. So stay tuned to the website, and we hope to see you guys next month. Thank you all so much.